In March of 1991, the regime of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was struggling desperately to hold on to power. Just 8 months earlier, Iraq attempted to forcibly annex the Emirate of Kuwait, its small, oil-rich neighbor to the south. But a coalition of 32 nations, led by the United States, had thrown the Iraqi army out of Kuwait in Operation Desert Storm. Much of Saddam's war machine had been destroyed in the process. Factions within Iraq, led by the Shiite Muslims in the south and the Kurds in the north, seized this opportunity to rise up and rid themselves of the brutal dictatorship which had suppressed them for over a decade. These rebel forces petitioned the coalition members for help. They had every reason to expect they'd get it. U.S. President George Bush had himself issued a statement calling for Iraqis to rise up and overthrow Saddam.
Iraqi armed forces.
Even the Iraqi president assumed the Americans would support the uprisings. But then, within days of the army's surrender, Saddam Hussein's intelligence operatives intercepted a series of secret communiques between Shiite rebel groups that told a different story.
The first group said, "We've been to ask the Americans for their help." And they said, "No, we're not going to help you because we think you're allied with Iran. So you're on your own." This was rushed to Saddam. And when he saw that, he knew he was saved. Because the Americans weren't going to support the rebels for this stupid reason that they thought this would hand the place to Iran, which really wasn't the case. He knew he was saved and he was going to make it.
For the better part of 20 years, Saddam Hussein had used assassination, torture, and even weapons of mass destruction to seize and solidify power in Iraq and the Middle East. He had survived coup attempts, rebellions, and a devastating war with neighboring Iran, each time emerging stronger than ever. Now, in the wake of his total and humiliating defeat in the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was delighted to discover that he had, once again, managed to land on his feet. And now, without interference from the outside world, he began to put down the uprisings. At the time of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had already ruled Iraq for 20 years, and for 10 years before that, his name was known and feared throughout the Middle East. He had been born and raised in a rough and lawless village on the outskirts of Tikrit, 100 miles north of Baghdad.
Saddam was brought up in a continuous state of poverty and needs which were not fulfilled and satisfied. He killed his grade school teacher when he was 11. And they came and found him with a gun under the pillow, sleeping soundly as if he did nothing.
In 1957, at the age of 20, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a nationalistic movement that was crossing national boundaries and spreading rapidly throughout the various Arab states. The Ba'aths, Saddam among them, were devoted to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the new president of Egypt, who had flaunted the European powers by nationalizing the Suez Canal. By 1961, in his early 20s, Saddam was one of a group of 10 young Ba'ath Party guerrillas assigned to assassinate Abd al-Karim Qasim, the Iraqi dictator whom they considered an obstacle to pan-Arab unity.
His first paid employment on completing his education was as an assassin. And this is a very rough customer who hasn't seen much of the outside world.
The young men botched the attempt, but Saddam's notoriety grew. By 1969, 6 years after the Ba'ath seized power, Saddam Hussein was the second most powerful man in the regime, deputy chairman of the ruling Revolutionary Command Council. General Ahmad Hassan al-Bakir governed as president, but Saddam was already making plans to succeed him.
He was everywhere. He was running finance, planning for the country's future. There was no military industry in Iraq. Saddam started the military industry from zero. and he was running it himself.
By the mid-70s, Saddam Hussein was the real power in Iraq. In 1979, he shoved the aging al-Bakr aside and assumed the presidency. Less than 2 weeks after taking office, Saddam convened an extraordinary meeting of the Ba'ath Party Congress for what would be a graphic demonstration of his ruling methods. The scene in Baghdad that night was almost a reenactment of a similar purge in Nazi Germany some 40 years earlier, one that carried the same name.
The night of the long knives, it was a coup arranged by Saddam. He killed all his opponents inside the party and government, more than 200 in one night. And gradually throughout the next week or two, he killed another 300-400 men. One of Saddam's favorite methods of getting rid of his competition, especially inside the party, was hitting them with a car and leaving them on the side road inside Baghdad. We had incidents all over Baghdad this way.
Once he had cemented power within Iraq, Saddam began to reinvent himself in the role of a great leader. His image could be seen everywhere. He was Saddam the soldier, the religious man, the family man. His picture adorned keychains, cake plates, and children's notebooks. He used television to turn himself into an Orwellian big brother. His secret police, the Amn al-Am, numbered in the tens of thousands. They too were everywhere, often in disguise. Wherever people congregated, Saddam's spy organization was watching.
So it is really the power base of Saddam. He knows what's going on inside the country because of it.
Although Saddam repressed his people politically, many of his programs, beginning in the mid-1970s, improved the lives of Iraqi citizens.
And they had a health system which actually puts ours to shame. Very well-trained doctors, everything free. Even if you were poor and you had something that couldn't be treated in Iraq, they'd fly you to London or Paris. It was actually a fantastically good system.
There was a tremendous emphasis on higher education and including women. When you traveled around Iraq, you would see women engineers heading construction crews, heading factories. This was virtually unprecedented, even today in other Arab countries.
With his purge of the Ba'ath Party leadership, Saddam had assumed total control of Iraq and her vast wealth of oil reserves. Now, with a checkbook to match his ambition, he embarked on a spending spree, buying the nuclear materials and deadly weapons with which he hoped to reshape the Middle East. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had long coveted an atomic bomb. In the early 70s, as the vice president of Iraq, Saddam had initiated a program he claimed was for the development of nuclear energy.
Nobody stopped to ask, why do you need nuclear power? Which was the cover, right? We're building nuclear power plants. Well, this is a nation that's floating on oil. So everyone sort of sat back and just ignored the basic question of why the Iraqis would be building a nuclear power grid.
In 1970, Dr. Qadir Hamza was a young Iraqi nuclear physicist. A graduate of MIT, Dr. Hamza was teaching at Florida State University when the Iraqi government ordered him to return to Baghdad and lay out an atomic program.
I was told if I don't go back, my father will suffer. I was the only probably US-educated nuclear physicist in the country. There were some Russian-trained nuclear physicists not credible to the Iraqi government. I was the best trained among them.
He goes back to Iraq. It's a very benign nuclear power program. He works on nuclear medicine and other safety issues with nuclear power. And then Saddam comes to power and lets them know that he's going to convert the nuclear power program into a nuclear weapons program. And at that point, they're kind of trapped. First of all, they have young children. Saddam is very good at alternating the carrot and the stick. He gives you everything as long as you go along with the program. And if you don't go along with the program, he throws you in prison and pulls your fingernails out.
Dr. Hamza and the other Iraqi scientists were told Iraq needed atomic weapons as a deterrent. Israel, sworn enemy of the Arab states, had a nuclear program that was already 20 years old. They were reported to be sitting on a large stockpile of nuclear weapons.
Deterrence in Iraq is not like deterrence in Israel. For the whole Arab world, Israel needs 100 bombs, probably, to make its threat realistic. Iraq needs 3 bombs to have deterrence against Israel. Israel at the time had only 3 major population areas. So 3 bombs would be enough.
The strategy of deterrence seemed reasonable to the scientists, but Dr. Hamza and his colleagues still harbored doubts. Suspecting that Saddam had another agenda, they made a decision to take the slowest route possible toward the development of a nuclear weapon.
Saddam's intent was not deterrence. Saddam wanted power, wanted to control the region. And Saddam is an adventurist. Saddam is the guy who shot the former president and tried to kill him. Saddam is not a regular, he's a thug. You don't give a thug a nuclear weapon.
In the late 70s, the French government agreed to sell a nuclear reactor to Iraq. It was to be called Osirik, after Osiris, the Egyptian god of the dead. Israel, which had purchased its own nuclear reactor from France as early as 1956, asked the United States to help stop the sale. But the French refused to cancel the contract. Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, began a top-secret campaign to destroy the reactor. On April 5, 1979, 3 days before the reactor core was to be shipped to Iraq, an explosion damaged the device. The blast delayed delivery for 2 years. Then, in June 1980, Yahya al-Mashad, an Egyptian nuclear scientist and a key figure in Iraq's nuclear program, was bludgeoned to death in a Paris hotel room. Many assumed Mossad had struck again. Others, like Dr. Khidir Hamza, weren't so sure. They believed the Egyptian might have been passing Iraqi nuclear secrets to the CIA, and Saddam had found out.
Saddam's security was suspecting that he was being debriefed and that the Egyptians passed the information to the US and effectively later to Israel. So there is a possibility that Saddam arranged the hit. But the media at the time carried it as if Israel did the hit, and possibly it did, we don't know.
There were several clues which indicated the murder of the Egyptian scientist might in fact have been the work of Saddam's Foreign Intelligence Service, the Mukhabarat. The most compelling of these involved the only witness to the crime, a prostitute who had reportedly let the killers into the hotel room. Before the authorities could question her, she was found dead in a Paris street. Like so many of Saddam's victims, she was run down by a car. In 1981, 2 years had passed since agents of the Israeli Mossad sabotaged the $250 million Osirik nuclear reactor while it was being built in France. Since then, it had been repaired and delivered to Iraq. Then, on June 7, 1981, a flight of American-made Israeli warplanes took less than 3 minutes to completely destroy the reactor. The destruction of Osirik was another major setback for Saddam Hussein. He would have to wait still longer for his atomic bomb. In the meantime, there were other weapons of mass destruction Saddam could get his hands on more quickly. In 1978, the fundamentalist revolution in Iran sent the Shah into exile and swept the Ayatollah Khomeini into power the following year. This new government, with its strong ties to Shiite Muslim factions inside Iraq, posed a threat to the regime of Saddam Hussein. Then, in 1980, when Muslim fanatics tried to assassinate Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, Saddam began a systematic purge of the Shiites. More than 100,000 Shiites and people with Iranian blood were rounded up and dumped on the Iranian frontier. Thousands were summarily executed. Later that same year, Iraq invaded Iran. By this time, Saddam Hussein was regarded both in the Arab world and the West as a dangerous man and a constant threat to world peace. Yet, compared to Iran, Saddam's regime was considered the lesser of two evils. The United States Embassy in Tehran had been seized in December of 1979, and the hostage crisis was ongoing. There was little love for Iran in America.
Throughout most of the 1980s, the US was essentially Iraq's ally. There's actually considerable evidence to suggest that the US put Saddam or encouraged Saddam to attack Iran in 1980. The US diplomats were held hostage in Tehran, Iran was in chaos, and the idea seems to have been born in the fertile brain of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was then National Security Advisor, that, okay, if Iraq attacks Iran, then the Iranians are suddenly going to have more important things to worry about than our hostages.
The Americans took an active role in backing Saddam in his fight with Iran, even providing secret spy satellite intelligence to Iraqi commanders. In 1982, when it looked as if the Iraqis might lose, the CIA set up a field station in Baghdad, which remained operational until nearly the end of the war. Here, allegiances sometimes became muddled in the name of expediency.
There was a moment in early 1986 during the Iran-Contra affair when, if you remember, we were also supplying arms to the Iranians. And there was a battle, I think in January or February 1986, when both sides, Iran and Iraq, were proceeding on the basis of intelligence supplied by the US.
Iraq had the stronger, better-equipped army, but Saddam had purged its best commanders and replaced them with loyal incompetence. The tide soon turned against them. Iran had a population 3 times that of Iraq and used their superior numbers to great advantage in human wave attacks that terrified and routed the Iraqis. Saddam Hussein hoped to defeat the enemy with a single cataclysmic stroke. He demanded his scientists give him an atomic bomb to use on the Iranians. Hussein al-Shahristani, one of Saddam's top nuclear officials, tried to reason with him.
When Saddam asked him, where is the plutonium? Shahristani made the mistake of telling him that we can't make a plutonium, it's against our treaty. It's a treaty violation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So Saddam was mad. He told him, you leave politics to us. You do your science, and that's it. Within 2 days, he was picked up, tortured, and a guard was stationed at the door of his house.
And that tends to change your attitude. And that happened to a number of high-ranking Iraqi scientists who balked at various stages of the nuclear weapons program and soon found themselves in prison being tortured every day. And then Saddam would let them out and put them back in the program like nothing ever happened.
Often these victims of Saddam's wrath would arrive home from prison to find a new Mercedes in their driveways, a gift from their benevolent leader. Iraq's nuclear officials got the message and redoubled their efforts to give Saddam the bomb. If they couldn't make one from scratch, they'd try and buy the components on the world market.
We were spending purchases, foreign purchases, 150 million a month. If you can imagine that. For example, when I went to Germany, I was given 40,000 in cash, $1 million I had in my name in Deutsche Bank in 1987, and 100 million transfer immediately, just in case I sign a deal.
Western intelligence agencies knew the Iraqis were in the market for a bomb, but there was scant formal protest.
The attitude of the West at that time, which had picked Iraq against Iran, was just sell, don't ask. That was generally the policy. So that even though these were secret operations that the Iraqis were carrying out to get technical expertise and components for their weapons of mass destruction projects, the Western intelligence agencies kind of looked the other way. If we had to pick a dog in that fight, we were going to pick Saddam.
Knowing it would be years before he could add an A-bomb to his arsenal, Saddam hired a Canadian engineer, Gerald Bull, to build a super gun capable of firing projectiles over 1,000 kilometers. These could carry chemical, biological, or even nuclear payloads. The barrel of the super gun would have measured 156 meters long. The recoil would be equivalent in force to a nuclear bomb, strong enough to register as a major seismic event. But before his super gun could be completed, Gerald Bull was assassinated, allegedly by Israeli agents. Undaunted, Saddam still pursued cheaper and far easier to build weapons of mass destruction. Iraqi buyers found suppliers in Germany and Yugoslavia who were more than willing to sell them the equipment and expertise needed to construct chemical manufacturing facilities inside Iraq.
The U.S. intelligence community was monitoring what the Germans were doing all through the 1980s, and they would draft white papers without any headers on them and deliver them by the U.S. Embassy in Bonn to the German government. They were called Demarches, which is a diplomatic term. It means a diplomatic note of protest. Well, there were so many of these demarches sent to the Germans and so little action by the Germans that some people have called them demarshmallows. Because they had absolutely no effect at all on the German government and their behavior.
The cover story was that the plants were for the manufacture of pesticides. But it was in these facilities that deadly forms of nerve gas for use against humans were perfected, using first animal and then human subjects, Kurds or other political prisoners. By the time the gas was ready in 1987, the war with Iran was close to a stalemate. Saddam was anxious to use the gas against the Iranians, but first the compounds needed to be tested on a large scale. And soon an opportunity presented itself. Iraqi Kurds, many of them in sympathy with fundamentalist Iran, had revolted in the north. This was a direct threat to Saddam's regime and just the excuse he was looking for.
They sprayed nerve gas over the village of Halabja and then sent in scientists and doctors to measure who died in what kind of position where. Were they indoors, were they outdoors, were they in alleys or streets? And then they did it again.
Thousands, including women and children, died agonizing deaths. The revolt ceased immediately.
He liked what he got. Fear. I mean, Halabja, he killed 5,000 with chemical weapons. He probably could have killed much more with less international hue and cry about it with conventional weapons. But he wouldn't get the fear effect it has with the Kurds. The Kurds are terrified of Saddam.
Satisfied with the results of his experiments on the Kurds, Saddam turned his chemicals on the Iranians.
They used them to deter what were called the human wave attacks, when the Iranians would have all these young boys linked arm to arm, marching across the battlefield, across the minefields. It was really a horrible, horrible thing.
The chemical attacks are credited by some military experts with bringing an abrupt end to a protracted war. 8 years of fighting had cost Iraq dearly in terms of resources and manpower. The Arab states could breathe easier now that the fundamentalist threat was, for the moment, put down. And Saddam Hussein, who had fought, he believed, on behalf of all Arabs, was ready to collect what was owed him. In 1988, Saddam Hussein emerged from Iraq's 8-year war with Iran as the most influential and feared political leader in the Arab world. But his financial situation was desperate. He had borrowed $40 billion from the Arab states to underwrite the long campaign, and now they were looking for repayment.
Saddam Hussein was frustrated. He had just fought an 8-year war with the Iranians. He had taken terrific losses, and he felt that he had represented the Arab world against the hated Persians, the Iranians. And nobody was giving him credit for it.
He wanted and expected the other Arab states to forgive the debts, but they refused. Then they took steps which he viewed as further provocation. Saddam accused OPEC members of overproducing oil, with the result that the price per barrel was cut nearly in half. And he accused his neighbors to the south, the Kuwaitis, of slant drilling from their side of the border into Iraq, stealing his reserves. Privately, Saddam had often threatened to invade and annex Kuwait. Now, as it appeared he might follow through on his threat, the rest of the world looked on with apprehension.
Initially, our CIA and certainly our Arab allies felt that he really wasn't going to take all of Kuwait, that the massing of troops on the border was in order to maybe go in there and seize the disputed oil fields where he had a difference with Kuwait.
But Saddam Hussein was not bluffing. He had calculated that the Western powers, particularly the United States, would not intervene in an Arab war.
He didn't care about world opinion, he cared about Arab opinion. And I believe that he thought that he could get away with it. He felt that he could go in to Kuwait, occupy Kuwait, cut a deal, and that the Arab world would be somewhat supportive of him.
His close advisors recognized he was treading on dangerous ground, but warning Saddam carried its own set of perils.
Tariq Aziz told a friend, you can't tell Saddam something is a bad idea. If it's his idea, that's a quick route to the firing squad. So what Tariq Aziz says he did was to say, tremendous idea, boss. I mean, that's just brilliant. And in fact, while we're at it, if you take Kuwait, obviously the Americans are going to come, they'll bring troops, to Saudi Arabia, and they'll, probably attack you. So while we're at it, why don't we just take Saudi Arabia too, which they could have done. And he says he hoped by that, saying that, so Saddam might pause and say, oh, really? You think the Americans are going to come and, react violently? And that would give him, an opening to an argument. Instead of which Saddam said, no, Tariq, you mustn't be impulsive, we mustn't be extremists here. The safe thing to be with Saddam is to be more hawkish than him.
It was not easy to be more hawkish than Saddam Hussein. On August 1st, 1990, the Iraqi army swept into Kuwait, taking Kuwait City and driving south all the way to the Saudi Arabian border. When the United Nations and an unprecedented coalition of 32 member nations demanded his immediate withdrawal, Saddam refused. Even as tens of thousands of coalition troops massed in Saudi Arabia, obviously preparing for an assault, Saddam would not be cowed. Speculation that he was bluffing ceased and concern grew. Was he in fact holding some cataclysmic trump card? And if provoked, would he play it? No one was more alarmed than Saddam's own physicists.
Our fear was that Saddam would use the nuclear fuel we have to build the bomb. We were afraid that he'll get very adventurous and ask for us, and he did. His son-in-law came and ordered us, within a month of invading Kuwait, to start a crash program, to make one bomb. We dragged our feet again. We knew what he would do with that one bomb. Either drop it on Israel or the Allies. Both are suicide. There's no question about it. Iraq will cease to exist. But to Saddam, it makes no difference. If he's going to go, he'll take everybody with him.
Iraqi scientists told Kamel Hossein, Saddam's son-in-law and chief of his secret police, that they had not quite 15 kilograms of atomic fuel, but 18 were needed for a bomb. And even if enough uranium was in hand, the device they had made was too big to make a viable weapon.
Something like 1.5 tons, not something you can deliver by any Iraqi missile. Iraq missiles payload was around 0.5 ton at the time. It depends on the range. So by November, 2 months before the Gulf War, when the son-in-law came in, we showed him the bomb we made, and he was mad. He expected that he could put it on a missile and shoot it when time comes.
Kamel Hossein reported back to Saddam, telling him his nuclear program was a dead end and that Iraq should concentrate on chemical and biological weapons. But then, in January 1991, Just a week before the coalition launched Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker sent a warning to Saddam Hussein via his foreign minister Tariq Aziz.
I said, if you use weapons of mass destruction against our forces, the American people will demand retribution. And I said, and we have the means to exact it.
U.S. intelligence sources described the Iraqi forces battle-hardened after their long war with Iran. They estimated that even if the Iraqis restricted themselves to conventional weapons, the Allies could expect up to 10,000 casualties. These estimates would prove to be highly inaccurate.
They were not battle-hardened, they were war-weary. And as soon as the shooting started, they started falling apart. High desertion rates, they didn't fight back. One pilot called it like bombing a tethered goat for 43 days.
Following a bombing campaign against strategic targets inside Iraq and the Iraqi army's forward positions in Kuwait, the coalition launched a ground campaign that liberated Kuwait in just 3 days. After 100 hours, U.S. President George Bush ordered a ceasefire. The advancing armies of the coalition pulled up short of invading Baghdad. Iraq did not employ biological or chemical weapons in the Gulf War, and many assume it was because Saddam Hussein had taken Secretary Baker's warning to heart. Yet intelligence reports gathered since the war indicate that Saddam had been ready and willing to use these weapons if the coalition attacked Baghdad. In the weeks prior to Desert Storm, Saddam's secret police, the Amn al-Am, buried large depositories of chemical and perhaps even biological weapons in various depots south of Baghdad. He gave orders that these were to be ignited with explosives if the Allies came after him. As it turned out, the Allies did not penetrate deeply into Iraq, and Saddam did not explode his chemical weapons. But Allied bombs dropped from the air may have done it for him.
The U.S. blew some of those depots. Some Allied troops, including the Czech troops, say they were other depots blown up, and that they saw chemical weapons more or less in open air, just open canisters in the desert. We believe that many of the U.S. troops and Allied troops were exposed to these weapons, to these chemicals, and that's what caused the Gulf War syndrome.
As sort of a corroboration that these chemical weapons might have been deployed and unwittingly blown up by the Americans and spread over the southern area of Iraq is that the hospitals, the Iraqi hospitals, were filled with people complaining of the same symptoms that Gulf War veterans came home with after the war.
With the nation he had hoped to modernize reduced by bombing to a pre-industrial state and his war machine all but destroyed, most outside observers assumed Saddam Hussein would be forced to step down. Those inside Iraq didn't believe this scenario. And indeed, the Iraqi dictator still had a few surprises left. For the weapons-producing nations of the world, Saddam Hussein had always been a top customer. Between the time he came to power in Iraq in 1979 and the Gulf War in 1990, the Iraqi president spent an estimated $65 billion building his military infrastructure. But once the Gulf War began, some of these nations that had profited handsomely in the arms sales found they had to spend far more to take the weapons away from him.
Hundreds of billions of dollars. How far you want to take that number depends on how you count it. But certainly the ordnance expense, the fact you had armies in the field for 4 or 5 months before you actually launched the campaign, and then the subsequent aftermath of the cleanup operations in Kuwait to put out the fires that had been set. But it was a tremendous amount of money, far in excess of what he ever paid for the weapons he purchased before he invaded.
In the wake of the Gulf War ceasefire on February 28, 1991, the Kurds and Shiites rebelled once more against Saddam's regime. However, without support from Kuwait's coalition liberators, the revolts failed and the rebels suffered savage retributions at the hands of Saddam's secret police and Republican Guard. U.S. leaders unknowingly helped Saddam's troops defeat the rebels when they agreed to allow the Iraqis to fly helicopters in the aftermath of the ceasefire. General Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East, was told the helicopters were for humanitarian aid. But they were, in effect, Iraqi gunships used to cut down Saddam's enemies. When it became clear Saddam was re-solidifying his power, many observers and even some coalition leaders called the ceasefire premature. Coalition troops, they said, should have invaded Baghdad and finished the job.
It was a marvelous opportunity to achieve what the administration really hoped for, which is getting rid of Saddam Hussein, and that opportunity was missed. So while we ended up winning the war, it was a modest victory that was really snatched from the jaws of triumph.
From the earliest days of the war, Saddam Hussein himself had been a priority target for American bombers. But by the end of the conflict, the U.S. had again come around to the opinion that Iraq under Saddam, the devil they knew, was preferable to any foreseeable alternatives.
One of the arguments here in Washington for leaving Saddam in power was that he was weakened now, thanks to the war, so he was not a threat anymore to important things like Saudi Arabian oil fields. But he was still just strong enough to be a kind of a barrier against the Iranians.
Despite this decision to leave Saddam in power, the United Nations, at the urging of the United States, opted to leave in place the sanctions they had invoked against Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. These would remain, the Iraqis were informed, until Saddam stopped building weapons of mass destruction and stepped down. But Saddam refused to comply and eventually kicked UN weapons inspectors out of Iraq. The sanctions consisted of economic embargoes that in effect cut Iraq off from the outside world. They were intended to force Saddam from power, but they succeeded only in perpetuating a state of privation and misery throughout Iraq, a condition the wily Iraqi dictator quickly turned to his own advantage.
Saddam's going to control it. He wants to keep his people poor. He wants the world to say that look at what the coalition did to my people. He has no incentive to see Iraq rehabilitated, to reinvigorate it, and to see it economically viable once again. It's not in his interest, and it's not going to happen until he's gone.
In an attempt to relieve the suffering of Iraqi citizens, the United Nations authorized a program whereby Iraq could trade oil for food and medicine. But the program led to the creation of a black market in which Saddam's family and inner circle participated. Little of the food or medicine reached those for whom it was intended. As suffering among average Iraqis became worse, the regime prospered.
Since the sanctions were imposed, there has been a lot of trade going on with Turkey and Oman, and Saddam has been reaping the benefits of that, collecting a lot of money and using the money for himself, building many houses, as well as for the people in his nucleus, whereas those on the outer skirts of the city are in shambles.
Even as Saddam exploited the oil for food program, he blamed the United States and her coalition allies for the tragic plight of his people.
The thing that's really so damaged America's reputation in the Middle East and other parts of the world, and certainly inside Iraq over the last 10 years, has been the economic sanctions, which have caused untold suffering and death and starvation and privation and so forth among the Iraqi population.
What you see is astounding. I mean, incubators that don't work, healthcare systems which are completely broken down, no medicine in the pharmacies. When you see a country under sanctions, it's almost worse than war, because it's just slow death and killing that takes place over a long time, killing many innocent people.
Yet, even in the face of such hardships, the prospect of an Iraq without Saddam, while attractive to some, was terrifying to most. Take away the Iraqi strongman and the fundamentalist Shiites were almost sure to gain power and open the door to Iran. If Iran was to get its hands on the Iraqi oil supply, OPEC would be plunged into turmoil with drastic repercussions for the world. Saddam had purged his army of all possible rivals, making a coup d'etat unlikely. Even if the president were to die in office, many observers believe that his son and heir apparent, Uday, would be even worse than his father. Uday had been active in the black market and had a gangster's penchant for machine guns and murder.
Saddam's eldest son, Uday Saddam, he's the guy who makes Saddam look nice, and he's universally loathed. In Iraq there is respect, hatred, but also a certain degree of respect for Saddam. Uday, just everyone in this process he hates, because he's a nasty, greedy psychopath.
At the end of the Gulf War, 20 years after he began his nuclear program, Saddam Hussein was still trying to build an atomic bomb. Dr. Qadir Hamza, his chief bomb maker, escaped to America with the help of the CIA.
In the end, we succeeded in one thing and failed in another. We did not give him an actual bomb after 20 years, and that we were successful. We failed by giving him the infrastructure, the very sophisticated, huge nuclear infrastructure that he can make not just one bomb, a large number of bombs. And that's what the Germans are saying now, that by 2005 you'll have at least 3 bombs, and it's an ongoing program.
Whether or not Saddam Hussein would have used an atomic weapon if he'd had it in the Gulf War is strictly conjecture. Certainly he must have been aware of the massive retaliation that would inevitably follow.
But would unseating him become serious if he has nuclear weapons? If Saddam is unseated, he is dead. He and his family, I mean, there is nowhere for him to go. There's so much blood on his hand, he'll be chased all over the world and killed. He knows that. But then, knowing who Saddam is and what he did before, would somebody risk trying to unseat him with an atomic bomb in his hand?
With a nuclear bomb in his possession, it would be easier for Saddam to use his chemical and biological weapons without fear of retaliation.
So what Saddam gets out of nuclear weapons is a lot of prestige in the region. He gets the deterrence effect of it. He gets a safe haven for his government to do what he wants effectively. And he gets entrenched in his seats, and he and his family. And that's a lot for a man, for just one weapon.
More than a decade after the Gulf War, the weakened regime of Saddam Hussein was no less a threat to peace in the region and in the world. And the nations of the coalition who had first backed him, then tried to kill him, only to unwittingly aid his resurrection, remained at odds as to how to deal with him, knowing full well that time was running out.